In the Sudan, there's no end to the fighting, and it seems no point in declaring a ceasefire either, because the violence just doesn't stop. On paper, the ceasefire was extended on Sunday for another 72 hours, but Sudan's army continues to bomb the capital, Khartoum. The armed forces are fighting a paramilitary group called the RSF, Rapid Support Forces, RSF. They're fighting for power. The worst hit is Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, also volatile regions like Darfur. Thousands of civilians have fled to neighboring nations. Some are taking land routes to Egypt or Chad. Others are flocking to Port Sudan at the Red Sea. They're trying to board evacuation ships.
Sudan is living through a moment of real terror. I'm talking about dead bodies in the streets. We smelled the dead bodies as we were coming from Khartoum. The firing, the shelling. Sudan is seriously in a state of real war.
The death toll keeps rising. The official figure is 500. The United Nations has reported a similar number, but it says the actual figure is most certainly much higher. And this is a conflict that the Sudan can ill afford. It was already among the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa. More than 600,000 children were being treated for acute malnutrition here. Now the fighting has made it worse. The supply of life-saving aid is being disrupted.
It's a very difficult situation in Sudan, and it's like the context is complex in the sense that the scale of this conflict encompasses 2/3 of the country, essentially, the Darfur, Kordofans, Khartoum. So it's a very insecure situation that we're all finding ourselves in. But the work continues. The work is continuing, and we just really pray for peace in those conditions to be able to enable even more delivery of services and scale up of those services.
She says the conflict encompasses 2/3 of the country. Does this mean the Sudan is facing another civil war? Considering its history, this is definitely possible. The army is led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the country's de facto ruler. He took power in a coup in 2021. His opponent is a man called General Mohammad Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemedti. He leads the paramilitary force called RSF. Now, Burhan and Hemedti were allies during the 2021 coup, but since then they've fallen out, and now they've taken up arms against each other. What triggered the fight? Well, they couldn't agree on how the country will transition into a democracy and who will control the RSF. How will it be incorporated into the Sudanese army? Ostensibly, this is what the fight was about, but make no mistake, this is a battle for power. As things stand, democracy is not coming to Sudan anytime soon. Burhan has said he will never sit down with Hemedti. Both groups are backed by foreign governments, and they have their own agendas. There have been repeated ceasefires, but they fail to hold. The threat of a civil war looms, and it won't be a first for the Sudan. For much of its independent history, this country has seen civil war and conflict. The Sudan was jointly ruled by Britain and Egypt. In 1956, it got independence. 1 year before that, the first civil war had already begun. It lasted till 1972. Then in 1983, the second civil war began. It went on till the year 2005. It resulted in the division of the country. A separate nation of South Sudan was formed in 2011. The previous civil wars were broadly based on ethnic and religious fault lines, but this one is different. Because this time both leaders, Burhan and Hemedti, belong to the same ethno-religious group. Their fight is about power, not secession. But it makes little difference to the people who are suffering.
If we fail to act now, it will be too late. The rainy season is coming in few weeks, and if we don't provide any assistance to the people, the road will be blocked, and all the refugees here will be stuck. And we definitely need to provide assistance in terms of water, health, and shelter as quickly as possible, in order to food also, in order to ensure that people are safe and protected.
The Sudan has seen thousands killed and millions displaced over the years. The constant violence has left it impoverished. Another civil war will destroy this country. The combatants and their foreign governments backing them need to stop and come to the talking table. Now let's turn from an incoming king to an outgoing feudal ruler. Turkey has some news. No, not that kind of news. Erdogan is still in power very much. In fact, he made an announcement yesterday. He said Turkish forces have killed the leader of ISIS. The latest ISIS leader was codenamed Abu Hussein al-Qureshi. He took charge of the terrorist group in November last year. This was after his predecessor was killed by Syrian forces. And now this leader has been neutralized too. But the war against the ISIS is still on. It began in 2014. The terrorists wanted to set up an Islamic caliphate. They were at war with American, Syrian and Turkish forces and a host of regional militias. Now 4 of its heads have been killed. Our next report has more.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan made an announcement yesterday. He announced a victory in the fight against terrorism.
I would like to share a new information with our public during this broadcast. There has been a development that shows a determined fight against terrorist organizations. Our National Intelligence Organization has been following the so-called leader of Daesh, codenamed Abu Hussein al-Qureshi, for a long time. This is the first time I'm announcing this news, that this individual was neutralized as part of an operation by the Turkish National Intelligence Organization in Syria yesterday. God willing, we will continue our fight against terrorist organizations without any exception.
Erdogan says Abu Hussein al-Qureshi was killed on Saturday. He was neutralized in a raid overseen by Turkey's National Intelligence Organization, the MIT. Syrian locals and security forces say the raid took place in the northern Syrian town of Gymnats. The town is controlled by Turkey-backed rebel groups. A resident says clashes started on the edge of Gymnats overnight from Saturday into Sunday. They took place at an abandoned farm that was being used as an Islamic school. The clashes reportedly lasted for about an hour. Residents say they were followed by an explosion. After that, security forces surrounded the area and prevented anyone from entering. ISIS has not made any announcement about its leader's death. Neither has the Turkey-backed opposition group known as the Syrian National Army. This is the group that has a security presence in the area. But even if ISIS acknowledges the death of Abu Hussein al-Qureshi, it is unlikely to be the end of the conflict. He will be the 4th ISIS leader killed by various anti-terrorism forces. Multiple forces have been fighting ISIS since 2014, and over the years, they've killed multiple ISIS leaders. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was the first so-called caliph. He took on the title in June 2014. This was when ISIS was at its peak. Baghdadi was killed in October 2019 by American forces. He was followed by his deputy, Abu Ibrahim al-Qureshi. This leader was killed in February 2022. He was also taken out by US forces. The third so-called caliph was Abu al-Hassan al-Qureshi. He lasted less than a year. He was killed by one of the many rebel groups in Syria in October 2022. They allied with the Syrian government to bring this ISIS leader down. Which brings us to the leader Turkey says it killed on Saturday, Abu Hussein al-Qureshi. He was in charge of ISIS for just 5 months. The tenures of the ISIS leaders are steadily dwindling, but the group still remains dangerous. Its offshoots in various parts of the world still cause havoc. It has the ability to inspire lone wolf attacks. This is when someone is radicalized and conducts a terror attack on their own. Lone wolf attacks are some of the hardest to stop because there is no group conspiring to commit it, and the attackers are always ready to die. The fact that ISIS encourages these attacks makes it as deadly as ever outside the territory it controls. The fight against terror demands constant vigilance, and until ISIS is completely uprooted, it won't stop. They'll just keep appointing new leaders one after the other, leaders who keep inspiring terror and lead to deaths around the world.
And now it's time for Vantage shots, images that tell the story. Starting with the US, a powerful tornado in Florida overturned cars and destroyed houses. Authorities are cleaning the debris and assessing the damage. In China, a wingsuiter successfully flew through the Tianmen cave, becoming the first Chinese man to ever do so. In Venezuela, Russian gymnasts participated at the Alba Games under their flag. And finally, what makes May the 1st significant, apart from the fact that it's May Day? We're taking you back in history. On this day, Fidel Castro banned elections and declared Cuba a socialist country. The year was 1961. Castro was addressing hundreds of thousands of Cubans at a May Day parade. He identified himself as a Marxist and Leninist. This happened right after the US government made an attempt to overthrow Castro's government, but was unsuccessful. He was unapologetically anti-American. It established close ties with the Soviet Union. During his rule, Castro created a one-party government. He wanted to control all aspects of Cuba's politics and economy. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Holy cow.
Oh my God, it's like right in front of it. Oh my
Email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony. The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.
Mismanaged vaccination drive, broken healthcare systems, citizens taking matters into their own hands. India's failure in managing the COVID-19 crisis is staggering.
want stories but without the West spin on it? Presenting Vantage with me, Palki Sharma, a first of its kind global show with an Indian perspective.